Hi, I'm Britt.
And my name is Alissa.
And this is Skeletales.
And this is the podcast where we strive to answer the age-old question of, is my dead grandma watching me?
We do. We also share true tales of the strange, unusual, and paranormal.
Heck yeah, we do, Britt. What are we talking about today?
Well, because I felt like I might die last week because I had COVID, I thought it was only appropriate that we do an episode on funerals and morgue experiences. So
that is the morbidest thing. Were you like literally planning your own funeral? I mean, I was planning your funeral, but I didn't know we were like on the same page.
I do not do well being sick. I genuinely will be like, this is my life. I am forever going to feel like hell. And just bury me now.
Just roll me away. Yeah. Call the mortician.
Glad I pulled through.
Me too. I am glad that you are alive. And I'm sure all the listeners are as well, because it wouldn't be nearly as fun without you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And speaking of fun, we put the fun in funerals.
Fuck yeah, we do.
There we go. All right. Hey, I've got a first story for you.
Oh, good. I'm so excited.
I'm not sure who this comes from. Let's just call them Jared. Sure. They say, my uncle runs a business making coffins. Some of these coffins are engraved beautifully and made of great quality wood, from mahogany, yellow wood, sandalwood, or even teak wood. And his warehouse is right next door to his house. When we stayed in his house one time, we were disturbed by the banging noises coming from his warehouse. I woke up to find him still watching TV late one night. I was in my mid-20s at this point. And I asked him, hey, why are you still awake? And he replied, yeah, I'm just waiting for a call. So just go back to sleep, darling. It's midnight, go get your rest. And I told him, yeah, I will. But that banging noise sounded like someone knocking on wood, and it's keeping me up. And he assured me, don't worry, it'll stop, with a kind of coy smile. Not quite understanding what he meant by waiting for a phone call related to banging on the wood or knocking on some wood, I left him for the night, and the noise did stop for about 10 minutes later, and there was a phone call. And I could hear him quietly whispering on the line, yes, I have a teak wood one ready for you tomorrow. And then he hung up. So then in the morning, when all of us were sitting down for breakfast, one of his workers came in and told him that the teakwood coffin was ready to be delivered to the funeral parlor. He just nodded and then left. And confused, I inquired, what happened last night? My uncle and my father looked at each other while my mother and sister were busy with their breakfast. My dad explained, well, whenever someone dies, the deceased always knocks on the coffin of their choosing and calls your uncle to let him know which one they want. Usually after the knocking and banging, there comes the phone call. And it's been happening for the last 20 years.
20 years? That's wild.
Custom ordered from the dead. I love it.
Is it always the teak most expensive one?
Right? I don't know. The dead person knocked on it. Sorry. Yeah, exactly.
That's the one
the
they
gold-plated one.
Uh-huh.
You don't want to deny your dead relative what they really wanted.
What they really want. Oh, that's a great story. Good one.
Hey, Britt, do you have a story?
As a matter of fact, I do. This one comes from Grace. Grace says, when I was younger, I caught the eye of a young mortician, which best intro to a story yet. Okay. We got to talking, and I found him to be very pleasant and interesting. He was a true gentleman. Every once in a while, he'd tell me some things that happened at his work, like there was a little girl they had as a client, and my friend said that she looked like a little princess, very delicate and also sweet, and her family was crushed. No one should ever outlive their child. There was crying and wailing at her funeral. You can just imagine the pain. And her father was just completely broken. He was in such pain that you could feel his heart breaking and his soul torn to pieces. This is what my friend was telling me. After they went home, the two funeral directors began their closing procedures and locked up the place. They heard a small child crying and calling for her daddy. Daddy! My friend said that it was the saddest thing that he'd ever experienced. He confessed to me that he thought that after the child was buried that she was still crying and asking for her daddy. The crying and calling out for Daddy just continued on and on. So my friend decided to call the father and told him to please come after hours so that he can tell his little girl to go home with him. The father was skeptical at first, but when he arrived at the funeral home, he heard his little girl too, calling for him, and he was so happy. He told his little princess to come home with him. He said, "Daddy loves you and misses you so much." And my friend said, after the father left, there was no more crying or asking for Daddy. And that was just one of the many stories he told me. There were plenty of paranormal things that happened at that funeral home.
That reminds me of the story that I read, but it wasn't at a funeral home, so I didn't include it. But it was a morgue worker it was like a stillborn baby, which was sad. And he was in the elevator taking the baby down to the morgue and heard a baby crying and was like, "Oh my God," and unzipped the bag thinking this child was alive, but it definitely was not. And just as he opened the bag, he heard a voice say, "Hush, little darling, it's going to be okay." A man's voice, like calming the baby, and then the crying stopped.
Whoa.
And the morgue worker was like, "I finished my business and got the fuck out of there." But people talk about this like calming presence from the other side, but I hadn't heard of one where the child is crying for their living parent.
I know. And I'm imagining these funeral directors like in this empty funeral home, hearing this crying nonstop, "Daddy, Daddy." And they're like, "What the fuck do we do? Like, how do we get it to stop?" And so clever thinking, I suppose, on his part, getting the dad to actually come back.
There are a few things as unsettling as hearing like a disembodied child crying.
Yes.
No. And then to have to call the person, like it seems very vulnerable that they would probably be very open, like losing a child. You'd be open to any sign. So
yeah,
I would think that I'd be hesitant, but at the same time, yeah, but they all heard it. Like, where's the recording of this? I want to listen to that one on YouTube or something or see it happen.
Well, so I will say Grace was an older gal. So I think that this probably happened likely in around the 60s is my guess.
Okay. Ooh, good one. I like it. I mean, sad. Also strange that they refer to the deceased as the client.
Yeah. Well, also it's tricky when they're dead. Alissa, do you have another story to share?
I do. So this one comes from Veronica, and they say, "I don't know if you can classify what I did as me being a cemetery worker. When I was a teenager, I got a summer job working with another girl in our city's biggest cemetery." I mean, that sounds like a cemetery worker to me. Our job was to pick up litter and fake flowers that would get blown away from graves by the wind. Basically, just tidying up so the groundskeepers didn't have to. That particular cemetery is one of the largest in the Midwest, with lots of paved roads and walkways, and it's popular with tourists, dog walkers, bicyclers, etc. And people will kind of use it as a park because it's very pretty, and people will unfortunately drop litter in there a lot. So one afternoon, the other girl and I were walking the paved roads in there with a big trash bag looking for litter. We came upon a particular area of the cemetery that has a lot of mausoleums and took the next lane around a corner that goes along the side of one mausoleum. As we rounded it, there was an older gentleman, maybe in his late 60s, early 70s, standing with his back against the side of the mausoleum, just looking at a plot of graves nearby. Now, here's two things that were kind of weird about him. The first thing, he was dressed a bit odd. His clothes were a little out of date and reminded me of how an older person would dress in the 1950s or 60s. Corduroy jacket in like 80-degree weather and one of those newsboy type caps, long pants, button-up shirt. Just something about the colors and patterns of his jacket, cap, and shirt screamed late 1950s, 60s to me. But when you think about it, a lot of elderly people kind of dress in out-of-date clothing anyway, so I shrugged it off. The second thing, he had a coffee mug he was drinking out of. Not a thermos or a styrofoam cup with a lid, an actual ceramic coffee mug that he was sipping out of. Just right there in the middle of the cemetery. As we walked by him, the other girl and I looked at him, and he looked up at us, and he smiled and raised the other hand he wasn't holding the coffee mug with and waved. We waved back and kept walking. We were only a few feet away from when the other girl said, "That was a little weird." And I said something to the extent of, "Yeah, that's what I thought." And we both looked over our shoulders back at him, but he was gone. We stopped and kind of took a few steps back to see if he'd walked around the mausoleum or something, but we couldn't see him anymore. We both kind of had a what the fuck moment, but we eventually quit looking around for him and went on with our job. A couple days later, we both showed up for work and went to the building where the groundskeepers kept their equipment to grab a trash bag and found one of the guys to let him know we were there. We talked to him a few minutes, and I brought up seeing the old man by the mausoleum in the east section. The groundskeeper smiled and asked, "Did he have a coffee mug?" We said, "Yeah." And he said, "Yep, that's our ghost. He's not really there." We pressed for more explanation, and he said he's always seen in that spot looking at a family plot and always has a coffee mug. He said there's a grave for the wife, 2 daughters, and the husband. The husband's grave says that he died in the early 70s, and the wife and 2 daughters' graves say they died a couple decades before, and the 3 of them have the exact same date of death. So they assume it was some kind of accident. They think he was the dad and that maybe he used to visit